Okay, so now we've got a better understanding about how variables actually work. Let's think about variables when we've got our structured program where we've got separate functions. So far we've looked at functions where we've got main and we've got other sub-functions. The crucial thing about variables is when we create a variable within a function, that variable is local to that function. You don't have access to that variable through its label, through its name, from anywhere else, from any other functions. Variables in Python by default are local to the functions they're created in and independent. Now obviously if that was the case and we can't send this information around, it would be pretty difficult to write code. But what we do is if we need to pass information that's stored in a variable from one function to another function, what we do is we pass the data into the function, and we say we're passing it in as an argument. And at the end of the function, if the function needs to send something back out, we can return that data as an argument or a return value back out the function. Now you've come across it already. When you issue the print command, you do print open parentheses and you put some string, text or variable in there. That is a argument that you're passing to the print function so it knows what to print. And you've already come across the concept of a return value. When you call the input function with input open close parentheses, it goes and runs that function, gets user input, and it passes a variable, passes some value back to that point, and you then go and assign it to a variable. So you've already used these concepts with the print function and the input function. What we're looking at now is how do we actually write those functions to accept the data that's passed in, and how do we write the functions to actually pass the data back out. So if the variables are independent, how is data passed? Well, the variable labels are independent, but we actually pass the quantity of the variable, the data, what's stored in the jam jar back out. In reality, we actually pass the memory reference back out, but the labels are kept local to that function. What does it mean? It means you can have the same variable name cropping up in different functions, but they are completely independent of each other. So you can have the variable age in one function, the variable age in another function, and they can be completely independent and mean different things. Clearly, good programming would dictate that you would use it for a similar purpose, but you don't have to. And there are reasons why sometimes we have different names in different functions for basically the same thing, and we'll look at that as we write code. And just as a side here, we can pass in multiple arguments into functions. And again, you've seen that with the print command. In the print command, we can put commas between things. And in fact, there what we're doing is we're passing in multiple arguments into the print function. And one really clever thing about Python is it can also pass multiple arguments back out, unlike a lot of other programming languages. So let's have a look at kind of how that works and the implications of it. So here's a bit of code. We've got our main function and we've just defined a couple of strings, player1 and player2. I made a Farouk. And we've defined a function called print welcome. Looking at how the def function print welcome is written, it's written def print welcome, and then in parentheses it's got a variable called name. Now what that means is within the function print welcome, we are defining a variable called name, and it's going to get given a value when the function is called. So within the function, when we do the command print welcome name, we're using the local variable name, whatever's been passed to it. So going back up to the main function now, after we've defined player1 and player2 as standard strings, we call the print welcome function, and the argument we pass to it is the variable player1. Now we're not passing the label player1 because player1 is a local variable in main. We are passing the contents of player1. So essentially we are passing the string Ahmed, and we're passing it to the print welcome function. So if you look again at the definition of the print welcome function, because in the brackets after it, it's got the variable name, that variable there is created to receive the string that's passed in. So the variable name receives the string Ahmed. And within the function we print welcome name, and name is Ahmed, so it prints welcome Ahmed. The function ends. Why does it end? Because the indentation is ends. There's no return here. That doesn't mean the function doesn't return. It returns at the end of that print statement because it's finished its job. What it then does is it goes back into main again, where it hits a second print welcome function call. And in this case we pass in the variable player2. Now again, we don't pass in the actual player2 label, we pass in the contents of player2. And player2 is pointing to the string Farouk, so we pass in Farouk. Where's that received? Well, it's the same function again, it's a print welcome function. We're now running it for a second time, and the second time we run it, the variable name now receives the string Farouk, and we then do print welcome Farouk. So if you type that code in, you'll find that that works pretty well, and there's kind of nothing amazing about it. What we need to now understand is exactly what's gone on with those parameters that we've passed in and out, and what we mean by these local variables. So, analysing the code in a bit more detail. In main, we assign player1 to the string Farouk. Sorry, player1 to the string Ahmed, and player2 gets assigned the string Farouk. So what really goes on? Well, in the main function we create a label called player1, and that label points to some memory location where the string Ahmed is stored. And we create a label, variable player2, and that points to memory location where the string Farouk is stored. So that's kind of the starting point. Now this is all in main. What we then do is, in the definition of the function print welcome, we've now got the variable name. So the variable name is now a local variable within the print welcome function. And when we call the function, as you can see at the top there, print welcome open parentheses player1 close parentheses, what actually happens? Well, if you look at player1 is pointing Ahmed. So when we call the function, we don't pass this label player1 in, we pass the memory reference to Ahmed. So the memory reference to Ahmed is passed in to the variable name. So the variable name now within our print welcome function points to Ahmed. How efficient is that? We've not had to duplicate the string and make a second copy of it. All we've had to do is pass the label in. So in fact this string could be 1000 bytes long, and all we've done is just pass the memory reference in. What does it mean? It means within our print welcome function, through the variable name, I've got access to Ahmed, which was the information that was passed in because it was using the label player1. So it looks like we've passed Ahmed into the function. What then happens next? Later on in the program we call the print welcome function with player2 as the argument. How does that work? Well, again, player2 references Farouk, so when we call the function with the player2 variable in here, it passes a memory reference in. So the second time we run the function, the same name variable that we've just been using now takes a value Farouk, and we run the print welcome function pointing at Farouk. And that's why the same function first printed Ahmed and then it printed Farouk, because we've just passed in different labels, player1's label, then player2's label. When we pass them in, they both got assigned to the variable name independently, which was a local variable to the print welcome function. Now, this is a real nitty-gritty detail of what's going on. This level of understanding will come as you do more and more with functions, and you'll need to understand this. But when you're starting explaining this and starting understand it, it's good enough just to say that Ahmed is passed in, and you can imagine name pointing to its own copy of Ahmed, and you can imagine Farouk being passed in and name pointing to its own instance of Farouk. This is actually the detail of what really goes on. So that's all pretty good. That's about passing arguments into functions. What happens when we want to pass information out? So you've called a function, you've passed some information in, it's done a bit of processing for you, and now you want to return something out of the function. Now, if we don't specify a return value, out of interest, a special value called none is actually returned. The code just has to return something, and it returns a special value called none. And we can see that if we look at some code. How does it actually work? At the point where we call the function in the code, the return value is put back into the calling function at that point and replaces the calling function. So if the calling function was in an assignment statement, the return value becomes part of that assignment statement. And that's how we do things like age equals input. We call the input function, it returns a value, it becomes part of an assignment statement, and that's assigned to the variable age. So that's how we work returning single arguments. We can return multiple arguments, and we'll worry about how to do that later on. So here's a very simple function. We've got a function called add, and it's passed in two parameters, num1 and num2. What does the function do? It creates a new variable called summation, which is just the addition of the two numbers, and then at the end it returns that value, it returns summation. So whenever we call the function, it's going to now return a value. If you look in the top code here, we assign num1 and num2 values, in this case 4 and 5. Now this you may not have seen before, it's just a compound assignment statement. We've got two variables on the left and we've got two values on the right. So 4 is assigned to num1 and 5 is assigned to num2. Again, it's just a neat little thing you can do in Python. We then call the function add with these two parameters num1 and num2. So we now should know that it's not num1 and num2 that are passed in, but it's their values. So 4 and 5 are passed into the add function. Within the add function, 4 and 5 are passed in, and they're assigned to a local variable called num1 and a local variable called num2. The fact that these are the same name up in main, completely irrelevant. It just makes sense to do it in this case. They are independent variables. These num1 and num2 are local to main. These num1 and num2 are local to the add function. So num1 and num2 down here have got the values 4 and 5. We add them together, which hopefully gives us 9. The value summation now is 9, and we return 9. So this command at the bottom here returns the value 9. Where does that 9 go? It comes back up here into this statement, replacing the function call. So the value of calling this function once it's run is the return value 9. So 9 is assigned to the value, the variable summation. Happens to be the same summation as down here, same name, I don't care. They are independent variables. So it's returned to a local variable up here, happens to also be called summation, and then we can print it at the end here. So again, cut and paste this code in, see if it works, and I'm sure it does. In fact, I know it does because I've tested it. Just to reiterate how it actually goes and how it works. Here we go. In main we've got num1 and num2. We now know that there's 0.2, 4 and 5 stored somewhere in memory. We know when we call the function down here by calling add num1 and num2. It's actually the memory references to num1 and num2 that are passed into the add function into two new variables called num1 and num2. So num1 now points to 4, num2 points to 5. We run the function as you would expect. What did our function do? It created the new variable called summation. That's over here in our add function. It's up here in the top. This gets a value 9, and at the end of this here we've got the return value, and it says return summation. So what does it do? It sends a reference to this memory location 9 back into the main function at the point where we call the add. And so what does that do? Oh, so I've got the code here. It returns the summation and it points it back to the code where it came from. So back there in main, if we just go back a couple of slides, when we call it back here, the value 9 is put back into this variable here and printed. Okay, so that's how we pass information in and out of functions. Hopefully it's cleared up why sometimes we use the same name, sometimes we use different names. We actually don't care. It's to do with kind of understanding the code and functional and not functional reasons. They are independent variables whether they have the same name or not. And hopefully it explains how we pass parameters in and out of functions. So something to leave you with, and I just flashed it up by mistake there, is have a figure out what that does. Type it in and see if you can work it out. Good luck. Thanks. Bye.